You and me, we are the same. Comment, like, and subscribe. All must be clear.
In early 1950, in the Soviet Union, in a cramped Soviet prison cart, an American prisoner named John H. Noble sits among many others who are being sent to the edge of the world to be forgotten. The train heads further and further north, approaching a plateau 12,000 feet above elevation and near the tip of the Ural Mountains. The train arrives at a grim-looking town, with black clouds and surrounded by camps enclosed by wooden poles and barbed wire, with inmates with pale faces and emaciated bodies. This is Vorkuta. This was to be John Noble's prison for the next 5 years. Built within the Arctic Circle, here winters were long and brutal, with temperatures dropping as deep as -52 degrees, and with short summers that experience a phenomenon known as polar days, where for 3 months the sun would not set. The only reason why Vorkuta came to exist was due to the vast amounts of coal beneath the permafrost ground. First, the Gulag camps were created to mine the coal, and from these camps, Vorkuta city was born. The surrounding camps became known as the Vorkuta Lag, one of the biggest Gulag systems in the Soviet Union, holding up to 73,000 prisoners at its peak in 1951. The Gulag was the name of the vast system of forced labor camps that were scattered across the breadth of the Soviet Union, and fell under the administration of the NKVD, who later became the MVD after World War II. Started by Lenin and then taken to the extreme under Stalin, the gulags were an instrument of state terror and political repression to keep the Soviet populace in line, as well as being an extremely cheap way to acquire labor for the natural resources within the Soviet Union. Besides criminals, who did make up a majority of the Gulag population, a giant chunk were also political prisoners, and it did not take that much to be sent to the Gulag for either criminal or political reasons. Stealing a pound of potatoes? Gulag. Joking about the Soviet officials? Gulag.
You overcook chicken, also jail.
Throughout its existence, around 18 million people would be sent to the Gulag, where life was hell on earth. They were often built in extremely remote parts of the Soviet Union, where natural resources were plenty, but where the environment wanted you dead. In these camps, you were forced to work 16 to 18-hour shifts, exposed to the elements in poor, lice-ridden clothes, beaten by corrupt guards, abused by inmate gangs known as the Black Noise, who often had alliances with the guards, all the while being fed a half serving of balandia soup, stale bread or potatoes, and meat or fish. And you would work your fingers to the bone for this, because if you failed to meet your daily quota, you would receive no food at all, and you would become a dokhiyadga and left to waste away. From its creation in 1918 to its dissolution in 1960, around 1.6 million people would die in the Gulag from starvation, overwork, sickness, the elements, and murder. But on the 5th of March 1953, an event would happen that would shock the Soviet Union and give hope to the prisoners of the Gulag.
Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, you have betrayed our nation and destroyed its people. I pray for your end and ask the Lord to forgive you. Tyrant.
With Stalin's death, there was a hope that his authoritarian laws would loosen and that many prisoners would have freedom, but the change was painfully slow. The amnesty of 1953 freed up to 1.35 million prisoners, but this amnesty only applied to non-political prisoners and political prisoners with a sentence of less than 5 years. And with the chaos of change happening within the Soviet government, many in the Gulag felt a sense of desperation, a feeling that they would either be abandoned and forgotten, that if there was something to be done, it would be now. In different gulags across the Soviet Union, including Vorkuta, inmates started to make improvised weapons and rally around figures to help lead them for what was to come next. And one of those leaders was John Noble, who would become a key figurehead during the 1953 Vorkuta Uprising.
We take Vorkuta!
Okay, so bear with me. This video is going to be unorthodox. What if I was to tell you what you experience in the game is not inspired by the Vorkuta Uprising of 1953, but rather a mission that is inspired by the Kingear Uprising of 1954, mixed with a smaller Vorkuta Uprising from World War II? I believe the writers of Black Ops took more inspiration from these two events more than the famous Vorkuta Uprising from the 50s, because there's a lot more similarities between these two and what we experience in the game. Now I say this because a thing you need to know about the many uprisings that happened in 1953 and 1954 is that nearly all these uprisings, including Vorkuta, were peaceful, done through protests and strikes by refusing to work. All except one, that being the Kingear Uprising. This one turned into something really nasty. And the World War II uprising, known as the Liseroid Uprising, is the only Gulag uprising that ever had prisoners get their hands on guns and have battles with the guards. So to make this video not confusing, when discussing parts, if you get confused about which uprising or date I'm talking about, look at the top left of the screen and you should be fine. With that established, let's get into this. Now straight off the bat, we must talk about the date. In the game, the mission is set in 1963. So there is a misconception, especially in the West, that the gulags are around throughout the entire existence of the Soviet Union. And it is understandable, since it wouldn't be until the 90s that the West would get a proper look at what life was actually like in the USSR. But by 1963, the Gulag system was gone, having officially ended by 1960. This is because the Gulag system was mainly a tool of Lenin and Stalin. So when scary Stalin died, the Soviet government almost immediately took steps to get rid of the Gulag system, because even for them, the system was evil. And this was part of the wider de-Stalinization process. But progress on this was slow, and mostly ramped up after Nikita Khrushchev gave his secret speech that politely called Stalin a monster. But in defense of the game, it never refers to Vorkuta as a gulag. It just calls it a labor camp. And it can pass with this because even though the Gulag system ended in 1960, forced labor as punishment did continue in the USSR and is still a thing in Russia to this day. But the scale of forced labor after 1960 was much smaller and less harsher than what we see in the game. As by looking at the game's intel files, you can see that it takes more inspiration from the Gulag era than the post-1960 labor camps. The Vorkuta camps were officially closed in 1962, so there wouldn't be any prison like we see in the game by 1963. But we must remember that in the game, that this is a Dragovich-owned facility, and most of the Dragovich facilities are implied to only be known to him because
even the Kremlin does not know what he is truly planning.
So there is a possibility that the Vorkuta in the game is closed on paper, but was still being used as an illegal black site prison that was unknown to the Kremlin. But for historical fiction, it's not that mad of a stretch. But now on to the meat of the uprisings. Now the Vorkuta uprising of 1953 did not start with some guard getting but with a passive walkout in a department of one of the camps around the 19th of July. Word spread of this throughout Vorkuta, and soon 18,000 of the prisoners were on strike that was organized by John Noble and several other prisoners who formed a committee. Instead of cracking down on the prisoners, the camp authority kept their distance. They increased the amount of guards they had on the perimeter and brought in tanks, but didn't take any forceful measures on the prisoners yet. This stage of the strike went on for about a week, where the prisoners were able to talk with some pretty high up members of the Soviet government, including State Attorney of the USSR Roman Rudenenko and the Internal Troops Commander Ivan Mazalenkov, issuing their demands for fair justice, some political changes, as well as the right for prisoners to be called by their names, not by the numbers given to them. This last point is a little Easter egg in the game. If you point your weapon at the prisoners, they don't have names. They are just called by their numbers, which is an interesting nod to the history of the dehumanizing process these prisoners went through. Because even if you died in the Gulag, your grave would not have your name, just your number. It wouldn't be until after the Gulag system was abolished that countless graves would eventually be given their names. Besides that little numbers bit, there's nothing Call of Duty-esque in the Vorkuta uprising of 1953. But swap over to the Kingear uprising. This kinda started with the And way more dramatically, the Kengir uprising started because the camp administrators were getting a little too comfortable with murdering prisoners, which actually had the effect of weakening their authority amongst the political prisoners, who in Kengir were pretty organized, striked more often, and were more willing to kill informers who worked for the administration. To try prevent an uprising, the administration brought in a large contingent of 650 Blotnois in the hope that they would clash with the politicals, as they normally did in other Gulag camps. But here, the Blotnois were outnumbered by the politicals, who were about 5,200 in strength and unified. Sensing the direction the wind was going, the Blotnois here instead teamed up with the politicals and then started the uprising themselves. In the game, we never see anything relating to the Blotnois, with the closest thing to a criminal being our big friendly giant Sergei, the monster of Magadan. But he is more of a reference to the wider Gulag system, as Magadan was another extremely brutal Gulag camp in eastern Siberia. But in the game, Reznov does make a statement that is reflective of many of the prisoners who were in the Gulag.
We are all soldiers without an army, betrayed, forgotten, abandoned.
There were hundreds of thousands of prisoners who were veterans and POWs of World War II who were kept long after the war finished. They were from a wide range of countries: Germans, Latvians, Ukrainians, Poles. Name a country that the Soviets went through, many a foe and friend of the Soviet ended up in the gulags, as well as a surprising amount of their own Soviet soldiers, because with them, they were either being punished for having surrendered to the Germans, or because they did too good of a job beating the Germans. When Reznov says,
But Stalin had little need for heroes.
He isn't just being salty, he's actually stating a fact. Anybody Stalin thought was becoming too popular for what they did in the war?
Right to jail, right away.
Heck, even Marshal Zhukov, who won the war for him, was stripped of his position by Stalin. But he was a little too popular to be gulagged. For Kengir, the experience of these ex-soldiers and partisans would come in handy in the siege to come. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back to the Blotnois. On the night of the 16th of May, 1954, Blotnois, using slingshots, took out all the camp lights and using an improvised battering ram, broke down a section of the wall in the courtyard. Guards on the towers fired at the Blotnois, killing 13, wounding 43, and forcing the rest to retreat and regroup. At this point, the politicals and the Blotnois armed themselves with shivs and makeshift weapons. Surprisingly though, after forcing the prisoners back, the guards themselves withdrew from the compound. The next day, the camp authorities came back, feigned acquiescence to the prisoners' demands, and the prisoners, feeling that they were heard, agreed to go back to their labors. Now, before I go into how this all fell apart for the guards, I need to talk about the women involved. Yes, there were many women prisoners who participated in both the Vorkuta and Kengir uprising. Even though it's not portrayed that much in media, many gulags shared both a male and female population. Though separated into different sections of the camp, it wasn't uncommon for them to be next to each other. As in Kengir, despite the dividing wall between their sections, there were many relationships formed between male and female prisoners by note that they would pass over the walls to each other. Now in the game, the uprising starts in a section of the mines, and even though the women did the same work as the men, they did not work together. So it's not inaccurate to have our section of the mines be all dudes. But look, I love the bro essence of this mission, but if there ever was a mission to include women and not have it clash with history, this mission would have been a great one to do it, as there were many women who were ex-partisans from the war who were in the gulag system. Have the women break in from a different section of the facility and join in the madness. Now in Kengir, the female equation factors in because shortly after the prisoners went back to work, the guards started preparing a cover story to claim that many of the male prisoners rioted just to get forceful with the female prisoners, when there was absolutely no evidence to support this. The guards went as far as to stage a photo shoot where they dressed up as prisoners and reenacted the assault of female prisoners. This, along with them sneakily trying to repair the wall themselves, pissed the living daylights out of the entire prison population, and once again they rioted to the point it forced the guards to flee from Kengir, leaving the entire facility in the hands of the prisoners. This would be the start of the 40-day siege of Kengir. Now, while besieged and in the midst of negotiating with the Soviet authorities, the prisoners sensed that a counterattack might happen, so they prepared defenses by building trenches and creating improvised sulfur and incendiary bombs, as well as grinding glass mixed with dust that was placed into buckets to be chucked at attackers to blind them. And unlike in the game where we are a horde, In Kingir, the defenses were a bit more organized, manned by groups of prisoners who called themselves detachments and were responsible for defending parts of the camp perimeter. But speaking about the Unleashing the Horde part, in Kingir, the prisoners did use camp speakers to broadcast propaganda speeches to the surrounding camp authorities to show that they were not going to back down, and also to frame the revolt in a positive way and as a fight against the corruption of the Beriarites. Such as in this speech, "Comrade soldiers, we are not afraid of you, and we ask you not to come into our zone. Don't shoot us, and don't buckle under the will of the Beriarites. We are not afraid of them, just as we are not afraid of death. We would rather die of hunger in this camp than give up to the Beriarite band. Don't soil your hands with the same dirty blood which your officers have on their hands." The Beriarites was a term for anyone who worked for Lavrenti Beria, a corrupt, really evil son of a bitch who was responsible for the Gulag expansion and so much more terrible things. He took power briefly after Stalin's death, but was killed a year early in a coup. The prisoners' speeches was an attempt to try find favor in the eyes of those who despise Beria. In the game, Reznov unleashes the Horde by giving a rousing speech of defiance through the camp speakers, and if you listen to the whole speech, Reznov also frames the uprising as a fight against the corrupt leaders of the Soviet Union.
Today, we will send a message to our corrupt and arrogant leaders.
So there are many aspects of the Kingir uprising that makes up the DNA of the Vorkuta mission. But we are missing a key ingredient that makes up a COD mission, and that is the guns. Hence the reason why I bring up the World War II Vorkuta uprising, better known as the Liseroid uprising of 1942. This one 100% started with the dude getting... Since this uprising has nothing to do with Stalin's death or the amnesty, this one happened because of a rumor saying there was going to be a major purge across Vorkuta, not just of the prisoners, but of some of the administration staff as well. So in one of the smaller logging camps called Liseroid, the camp administrator called Mark Retignuni, who himself was an ex-inmate of Vorkuta, made an alliance with about 100 of the prisoners and some free men to start an uprising and to try to get the surrounding camps and villages to join in an attempt to prevent the coming purge. On the 24th of January 1942, Mark lured the prison guards into the camp bathhouse, where the prisoners jumped them and disarmed them. Now, this wasn't an all-out brawl like in the beginning of the game's mission, but one of the guards was because he resisted too much, and a few others were wounded. Now equipped with firearms, Mark geared up his small army of rebels, with better winter clothes, food, and horse-drawn carriages, and marched on the nearby village of Ust-Usa to spread his rebellion further. Now, I'm not going to compare the weapons of the Vorkuta uprising to the 1940s or the 1950s, because this mission clearly states it's set in 1963. So we will hold the weapons the Soviet guards were using to that year. I'm mostly glad to say that all the weapons, with the exception of 3 plus 1 attachment, are period appropriate and would have been used by the MVD in the early 1960s. The first out-of-place one is the KS-23 shotgun, which only came into service in 1981. The second out-of-place one is the model 1887 shotgun. Yes, it has been around since 1887, but there's no evidence I could find for them being in the Soviet Union. But look, I wouldn't read too much into this part, because it only features in the escape segment, which is pretty much the developers having fun and recreating Terminator 2 mixed with the Great Escape. So this inclusion is just for fun escapism. But going through the more appropriate weapons, the first one we get is a Shiv. These came into service around 3.3 million BC, when Unga Bunga invented it to escape captivity. So Shivs being around in 1963 is fine. The Makarov is perfectly fine, as they did come into service in the USSR in 1951. And an interesting fact, it's the second most produced pistol on the planet. There are RPGs which do feature in this mission. The RPGs in the game are based on the RPG-7, which did come into service in 1961, so they are period appropriate. The Dishka heavy machine guns are fine, since they have also been around since 1938. And of course, the most iconic assault rifle of all time, the AK-47, is perfectly fine, as they've been around since 1949 and was being supplied to the MVD in the early 1960s. And I must say, out of all the COD games, this is my favorite portrayal of the AK. Just something about it. But there is a specific AK-47 in this mission that I know all of you use.
We are the same.
It is this one you find on the pillar with the GP-25 grenade launcher. Now, even though the Americans would adopt underslug grenade launchers by the end of the 1960s, the Soviets didn't officially do the same until 1978, with the first being the GP-25. So the GP-25 is out of place, but in 1963, the Soviets did start experimenting with underslug designs, such as the OKG-40. Given the game likes to portray Cold War experimental weapons that never came into full service, I think it would have been more appropriate for them to have given us the OKJ-40 for the Russian grenade launcher. But either ways, this thing is so handy in this mission. Now, the most surprising weapon for me while researching for this vid is actually the Death Machine, aka that Fist of Iron! At first, I was ready to just ignore this because it's kind of common knowledge that going handheld with a minigun Predator style has just never been a thing in real life in terms of warfare. But during the Vietnam War, for very specific missions, some MAC-V SOG and Navy SEAL units did modify M60s by cutting down their barrels and connecting them to backpacks that held up to 500 rounds of ammunition. And these monstrosities were nicknamed Death Machines. So even though the Death Machine in the game isn't an accurate portrayal and is early by a few years, it is at least an acknowledgement and reference to the real one, though taken to the extreme by having it be a minigun instead of a mutated M60. Rule of cool, I guess. But either ways, this small tidbit has honestly made me respect the efforts the developers of Black Ops 1 put into researching the history, as it does show that the developers aren't just coming up with random things, but connecting as much real history as they could to the insane story it tells. Now, this is where things turn tragic for all three rebellions, and in researching this, I realized that the over-the-top way the Soviets tried to crush the uprising in the game is surprisingly accurate to how the Soviets did respond to the uprisings in real life. Now, even though the Vorkuta uprising of 1953 was a mostly peaceful protest by the prisoners, when the guards did crack down on it, it did turn bloody. After 2 weeks of strikes, the authorities grew impatient with the uprising not ending, and on the 1st of August, the guards opened fire on the protesting prisoners. Between 42 to 66 prisoners were killed when the guards started firing, and over 135 prisoners were wounded, with many of them dying due to the absence of medical aid. Now, while being a bloody massacre, this wasn't anything close to the battle we see in the game. Hence, I don't see how this event could be the main inspiration for the mission. But with King Gear, it did end in a battle where two sides did fight each other, though even here it was extremely one-sided and makes the massacre in Vorkuta seem small. In the early hours of June 26th, flares shot up into the sky. Soviet snipers quickly killed prisoner lookouts on the roofs. This was followed by an all-out assault by 1,700 troops in battle gear, 90 dogs, and 5 T-34 tanks on the camp complex. In the game, when the guards do ramp up the intensity of the counterattacks, they bring in Mi-8 helicopters, which are period appropriate, technical style trucks, and armored guards, but they never go as far as bringing in tanks and a small army of dogs. Meaning, what we experience in the game is actually light in comparison to the terms of how the Soviets would respond to such uprisings in real life. But I do think the intensity of the mission during these parts does a pretty good job in portraying how intense a crackdown on a Gulag uprising would be, and how desperate the situation would be for the prisoners. When the overwhelming assault on King Gear started, most of the prisoners panicked, but several of the detachments of prisoners held their ground and put up a desperate fight. Throwing improvised bombs and weapons, they were able to wound up to 40 of the attacking soldiers, as well as bring down a guard tower with incendiary bombs. But lacking any proper firearms, they were quickly overrun. At this point, the battle was pretty much over, but what followed was an orgy of bloodshed that got sadistic. Besides the soldiers shooting the prisoners, the main way prisoners were killed was by being deliberately targeted and crushed by tanks as they drove back and forth across the camp. As stated by a survivor named Libov Buyshatska, the whole camp had turned into ruins, and the dead and the wounded were lying everywhere. Tanks were crushing the living. Within seconds, I could see the brains and entrails of my friends on the walls of the barracks. Friends with whom I had shared my grief for so many years. Only after 90 minutes of death were the medics allowed in by the authorities to treat prisoners. According to the Soviet accounts, which are known for underreporting, 37 people died and 106 were wounded. But according to the prisoners who survived, the death toll was actually as high as 700. So with Kingir, we have something that's a lot more similar to what we experienced in the game in terms of ingenuity, chaos, and intensity, though definitely less glorious. But in regards to a Gulag rebellion where prisoners use guns to battle the guards, the Liseroid Uprising is the only one you will find. After reaching the village of Usta Usa, and following a pre-arranged plan, Mark's small army of prisoners assaulted the village, targeting buildings that would be key in securing a base for the uprising to spread. They successfully took over the NKVD office, freeing 38 more prisoners and taking over the telephone and telegraph station of the village. But the prisoners failed to take over the police station and nearby airfield that was fiercely defended by guards and locals. In the game, we do have a similar type of strategy where Reznov directs the prisoners to attack key buildings in Vorkuta to help spread the rebellion and acquire heavier firepower. But with the Usta Usa assault, most of the villagers sided with the guards and news got out about the attack. Soon, a counterattack by overwhelming NKVD forces pushed the prisoners out after a bloody battle where both sides took heavy casualties. Mark, with what remaining prisoners he had, retreated for about 4 days to the nearby Liza River. And after digging trenches in the snow, Mark and his small army beat back the chasing forces. But the cost was bloody, as only 26 prisoners were left remaining. All Mark did was buy time, and he knew that countless more would be after him. He separated his remaining survivors into smaller groups in an attempt to escape from the area, but they were all hunted down. Mark's own small group made it about 108 miles on foot before being overtaken and surrounded by the hunting force. After 23 hours of fighting and running low on ammo, Mark and a few of his followers took their own lives. The rest of the prisoners were then mostly executed and a handful sent back to the Vorkuta lag.
The hypocritical decadence of Vorkuta's leaders lays the key to step 8.
Freedom.
We shall say farewell to the Kingir part of the story. As for step 8, we shall just keep it to Vorkuta. With all the misery that prisoners experienced in Vorkuta, you'd expect there would be tons of escape attempts, but there's very little info you can find on this. And this is just down to the harsh reality that Vorkuta was pretty much impossible to escape from. And it's not the facilities that made it impossible, but just the extremely remote location and the harsh environment. Like, pretend you're a Soviet citizen during the Gulag era. You escape Vorkuta on foot. Besides traveling half-starved, in minus 40 degrees, and having an army of MVD on your ass. The closest civilization center to Vorkuta is Salikard, which is 80 miles away, on the other side of the Ural Mountains, and this city also has more gulags around it. And even if by some miracle you do make it home, you're hiding in a police state with the KGB breathing down everyone's necks, and when word gets out that you escaped, they will most likely chuck your family into the gulag. And given that you would have been raised from birth on Soviet propaganda claiming that the West is even worse to live in, there's a high chance that leaving the Soviet Union seems a no better option in your eyes. This is why when these uprisings started, especially in the 1950s, their main goal was social change, because that was their best chance of having freedom. And despite the tragedies of how these uprisings turned out, they were a piece of the puzzle that ultimately helped convince the Soviet government to eventually abolish the Gulag system, which did lead to millions of surviving prisoners eventually being free. Now, even though you couldn't escape Vorkuta, you could outsmart it. And this is what John H. Noble did. Only a few select prisoners in the Gulag could send letters. John did not have this privilege. So John, in secret, wrote a letter for a relative in Germany that was smuggled out on the back of a prisoner who was being freed. Written in a way as to avoid Soviet censors, John did not write who sent the letter, but left a clue to identify himself by writing, "Your noble nephew requests." This was enough for his relative to sense that something was odd, and he sent this letter on to his family in America, who in turn told the US government that he was being held in Russia. After further investigation, President Dwight D. Eisenhower personally got involved and got John his freedom. In 1955, John was released along with several other American captives who made it back to the United States and went on to write 2 books about his experience of living in Vorkuta, making John one of the main sources of information about the Vorkuta land. Now fast forward to 1963 in COD. Reznov and Mason's plan to escape by train is smart, as it would help them traverse big swaths of the wilderness quickly. But there is an issue with this plan. The train lines to and from Vorkuta pass through many other Gulag labor camp facilities, And even if Mason avoided the inspections, the chances that this train is going all the way to the edge of the Iron Curtain are very unlikely. So at some point, Mason would have to swap trains and most probably cross more of the wilderness on foot. Now I know it's just a game, and I do love the concept of this part as it does sell how much of a badass Mason is. I'm not going to hold his journey to too much scrutiny. Just saying though, if anybody pulled something like that off in real life, shit. No wonder Kennedy wanted to meet Mason.
Hell do you think that I know where it is?
You're in Vorkuta, Mason. We know what happens in Vorkuta. They programmed you.
Well, if you're going to have a 60s schizo story about being brainwashed by the Soviets, you may as well pick the Gulag that held up to 4,000 American prisoners during the early Cold War. John H. Noble was not the only American in Vorkuta, though he was probably the most innocent. His crime was simply being the son of an American Camry factory owner in East Germany, and the Soviets put John and his father in the Gulag on fake charges of spying, so they could take over the factory. The other American prisoners, though, were mainly US military, who the Soviets got in whatever means they could. Some were kidnapped along the Iron Curtain, shot down pilots who were spying on the Soviets, and a big chunk were actually POWs from the Korean War, who were secretly sent to the Soviets by the North Koreans. This setting works excellently for the historical fictional element of the game, because now Dragovich has a pool of American test subjects to brainwash, since MK Ultra style mindfucking someone does work in this universe. Remember, Mason is not the only one who is brainwashed, and the numbers broadcast is for
all across America. Dragovich has sleeper cells waiting for the signal to release the Nova 6.
And where do you think those sleeper cells came from? Well, I'm never going to say the next video is going to be short ever again, because damn, there was way more hidden history in this than I was expecting. But honestly, it was sweet learning more of this stuff. Thanks for watching, folks. Disclaimer again, I'm not a professional historian. I love games and history, and I just want to share it with you. So if there's anything else that you, the viewer, could add, maybe something that I missed out or even got wrong, please write down in the comments below and I will read it. The more history we learn, the better we are. Also, if you want access to all the declassified info that I use for these videos, as well as movie lists, or just to support the channel, join me on Patreon and help be part of the creative process. Have a wonderful day, folks, and may God bless you. See you.